Toxic relationships are commonplace in one form of media or another. Ryan and Kelly from The Office, and Ross and Rachel from Friends are two that come to mind right away. Rest in peace, Matthew Perry, who unfortunately passed while I was making this script. But these couples have something in common with their toxicity, though. They were outwardly toxic. The lovers in both of their respective shows were characterized by actions that exhibited jealousy, deceit, and oftentimes straight up full fledged manipulation. They perfectly encapsulate what we think to be the quote unquote toxic relationship. But toxicity in a relationship can come from a variety of different places, with one such being emotional neglect, a pattern in which an individual's affectional needs are constantly disregarded. The effect on one's well being is almost always paramount, and it can come in a multitude of forms. Those being, but not limited to, lack of consideration, lack of awareness, and a lack of response to emotions. These feelings of neglect can leave someone feeling helpless, meaningless, trapped. And it's not always malicious. It can come from a place of unawareness from the lover committing the emotional neglect. But to be able to move on from a relationship like this, whether that's moving on or realizing your mistakes, represents growth and maturity. Enter Betty Groff and her current former, honestly it's still ambiguous, husband Simon Petrikov from the universe of... For some context, Simon Petrikov is a human whose transformed persona is the Ice King, a misunderstood villain who quickly gains sympathy from the show's audience once his backstory is revealed. Part of this is that Betty Groff, Simon's partner in both work and life, opted to leave him instead of dealing with his descent into madness and his transition into the Ice King. It is later revealed, however, that Betty had not left Simon, but in fact jumped through a portal to in-series present day after being contacted by a temporarily turned Simon, Ice King. Once Simon returns to his state as Ice King, however, Betty goes through great lengths to revert the Ice King back to his human form, sacrificing everything to get him back. In the series finale, after summoning Golb, the Adventure Time universe's literal embodiment of chaos and disorder, to fix Ice King, in a final Gambit-esque move, Betty fuses with Golb as part of a wish
to keep Simon safe.
Through a multitude of sacrifices, all Betty wants is the safety of her lover. In Adventure Time's sequel series, Fionna and Cake, Simon Petrikov battles depression. He spent the last 12 years trying to find a way to get to Betty. This affects his day-to-day life. The mundaneness eats away at him. He tries to confide in those who care about him, but even that's not much of an aid, as he continues to seek Betty in any way he can. Through his attempt to bring Betty back, in a particular ritual, he inadvertently summons Fionna and Cake from a different universe, and through them finds purpose. He must become the Ice King again to restore Fionna and Cake's world to its previously magical state. They take on a multiversal journey to do just this. And through it all, Simon encounters alternate reality versions of those whose lives he has affected. Marceline, whom he raised as a child, without his presence, is a narcissistic psychopath. Finn, who without Simon once wore the crown himself and has to therefore deal with the associated trauma, and Princess Bubblegum, whom a different version of Simon made insane to save himself from the crown. The end of this adventure leaves Simon face to face with Golb Betty, the fanonized name for the fusion between Golb and Betty. While on their inter-universal travels, Simon relays the story of how he met Betty to Fionna. He tells the story of an awestruck college-age student meeting a figure she revered. Her willingness to drop everything to go on an expedition with him to find the sacred Enchiridion, going to the lengths of postponing a 6-month-long trip to Australia to do so. The story of her falling in love with him, her letting him take all the credit for their expedition, her beginning to pack for her postponed trip to Australia, but him going through the trouble of finding her and stopping her right before she leaves, bags and all, to reciprocate his feelings of love, telling her how he wants her by his side. The story where the two shared an embrace, one where, if viewed closely, Betty ends up a step lower than Simon, a foretelling sign of their relationship. The forestalling of Betty's trip to Australia, the prompt claiming of sole credit for something they both worked on, the deeper meaning hidden in their positions after embrace, and a comment Fionna makes on expecting Simon to go to Australia with Betty all point to the greater picture that was the emotional neglect in Simon and Betty's relationship. And it takes Simon being one-on-one with Betty to realize this. Having acquired a version of the crown from the multiverse, Simon, now in possession of the object that drove him mad in the first place, motions to put it on. A sacrificial action for Fionna and Cake. However, before he can, Betty transports his soul 1,000 years in the future, into the body of a small gray cat named Shermie. Simon, even in Shermie's body, still seeks the crown. This leads him to play a choose-your-own-adventure story in which two characters, Casper and Nova, seek a similar crown. Each time a scenario presents itself, Simon has to choose between picking Casper or Nova's decision. And in the end, he is left with one decision to make as Casper: to either let Nova die or to save Nova, but in doing so, forget she exists. Simon registers that time and time again he chose what Casper wanted, neglecting what Nova wanted. A moment of realization hits Simon, and he connects this fictitious book to the reality that was him and Betty. Simon himself had made countless decisions without regard for Betty's wants and needs, and almost placing the crown on his head again was the pinnacle of that. The pinnacle of emotional neglect. Betty sends him back to that day at the bus stop, and Simon tries to play it out how he wishes he would have. They embrace on equal footing, before both acknowledging this was not how their relationship was spent. Simon and Betty say their final goodbyes. Now with closure, Simon realizes the fact that there's more to life than wallowing over a person's absence, that he's had a positive impact on the lives of many, the lives of Fionna and Cake, the life of Marceline, and the lives of many others around him as well. Simon feels as though he can now live peacefully. He now realizes his purpose, that there's so much more to life than one relationship. And although it takes some growth to realize, one's impact on others is much greater than their impact on just one person, no matter the person's significance in one's life. Forgiving and forgetting lets someone work on themselves as an individual. Another example I'd like to compare this to is the Broadway musical Hadestown, and how, in the show, Hades becomes too engrossed in his wealth, power, and control of the underworld to fulfill his wife Persephone's needs. One of my favorite songs from the musical, Epic 3, includes this line sung by Orpheus: "And what has become of the heart of that man, now that the man is king? What has become of the heart of that man, now that he has everything?" Hades sacrificed so much to give the perfect life to Persephone, so much so that he doesn't realize that he lost her along the way. What he thought was perfect isn't, and he doesn't truly, as Orpheus implies, have everything. Through Epic 3, Orpheus aids Hades in realizing the errors of his ways, much like Casper and Nova did for Simon. In this case, in another song, the reprise of Wait for Me, Hades and Persephone agree to try again next fall, as Persephone has to return to the world of the living for springtime. This provides their love a second chance. He also gives Orpheus and Eurydice a second chance at both life and love, something previously unthinkable for him to do. The growth of both Hades and Simon parallel each other to a significant degree. Whether it's a final goodbye or a second chance at love, there is a growth in realization of purpose that stem from passing by and through a toxic aspect of a relationship. This makes one more ready to put oneself aside for others, more conscientious. It makes someone into a more holistic person